Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Bridge of Worlds podcast. I'm your host, Ioannis Kokkinos. Thank you so much for joining me. If you're on YouTube watching, thank you for tuning in. If you're on one of the podcast platforms, thank you for tuning in as well. So today, you fully well know what I'll be talking about if you did see last week's episode. This episode feels like a bit of a conclusion as far as the esoteric Christianity and sacred sexuality um, adventure is concerned. So I did say that today I'll be comparing the difference between the Christ fire and the Luciferian fire. So I have touched upon these concepts throughout a few episodes. But today I really want to paint the picture of what this means, what both mean, what the differences are, and how sexual energy, sexuality can be an expression of both, right? So we don't normally think of Christ or Jesus Christ, Christ energy, when we are in sexual union. But I hope by now, if you've watched all the episodes, we fully well know and understand that the Christ energy is very much present in sexual union, right? So divine union, the union of the masculine and the feminine. There's a lot of symbolism, there's a lot of citations, a lot of parables, metaphors, right, throughout the Bible, throughout the New Testament, Revelation, the Gnostic Gospels that do speak to this creed, this universal teaching of union between the masculine and the feminine. So last week I talked about Adam and Eve. I'll be elaborating more, right? This is such a big piece of the puzzle, right? As far as Christianity's and Judaism's version of creation is concerned, right? Adam, the masculine polarity, Eve, the feminine polarity, the serpent, the sexual energy that tempted Eve, right? And the fall that happened. So if you are new here, I would definitely touch base with last week's episode and all the episodes in regards to Christianity and sacred sexuality. Again, I want to emphasize here that when I say sacred sexuality, I mean the spiritual, energetic union of the masculine and of the feminine, the masculine and feminine within us, and the masculine and feminine in the cosmos, in the world, in life, right? The active force, the receptive force. So let's get into it. I'm going to talk about fire, the inner fire, right? This is what today's episode is about. And basically, I'll bring in the chakras into the conversation, the chakras as part of Hindu Tantrism, and also the circulating of the sexual energy, which happens in the microcosmic orbit, in Kundalini yoga. So it does feel like this episode is kind of bringing everything together. And I really want to emphasize here the difference between Christ fire and Luciferian fire. So let's start with Lucifer. Lucifer, the etymological meaning of this name actually comes from the name the Romans gave to the planet Venus back in Roman times. So every planet goes through a retrograde journey, which means like from our vantage point here on Earth, it seems like the planet is moving backward, but that's not exactly the case. It just looks like it is. So the planet Venus, as well as planet Mercury, when they're in retrograde, they, as part of the ancient tradition, the astrological tradition, signifies that they are going through an underworld journey. They're moving through the underworld because the retrograde represents like a more introspective, a more karmic, it's like an energy of going within, right? When a planet is moving forward, it's the outward expression of the energy. So this is more of an inward journey, and so this is seen as an underworld journey. So of course, Lucifer, as part of Christian lore, is seen as the ruler of hell, the ruler of the underworld. And because Lucifer translates to morning star, it's actually the bringer of light. This just signifies that Lucifer is just on the opposite side of the coin where the Christ dwells. So I have talked about how Christ moves through battle, right? Especially as far as raising the Christ energy within us is concerned. And this happens at the solar plexus, which I'll get into in a little bit. But basically, Lucifer and Christ are two sides of the same coin. So the way I'm going to talk about Lucifer today is really from the Jungian perspective, which, as I said last week, is basically our shadow, right? So I've been talking about shadow work. I've been talking about how to work and move with our own shadow. Every single one of us has a shadow. And in Jungian psychology, in the Jungian school of thought, it's actually that when we transmute and transform our shadow, this is where we realize illumination, power, awareness, wisdom, and so on and so forth. Lucifer, however, is the giver of false light if we do not learn to move the energy up. So we start with fire, right? We start with Kundalini fire, serpent fire at the base of our spine. Lucifer showed up as a serpent in the Garden of Eden to tempt Eve to eat fruit from the tree of knowledge so that separation can happen, so that duality can happen. So the split between spirit and matter, the split between masculine and feminine can occur. But that's supposed to happen because that's what happened in creation. And I'm not talking about biblical creation story. I'm talking about the universe, right? The universe was only energy once upon a time, and then matter started to appear. So that is what represents the split. That is the split between masculine and feminine, because the masculine is the spiritual principle and the feminine is the material principle. So we start with fire at the base, right at the root chakra, our very first chakra, and we are meant to raise this fire. I've been saying this over and over and over again. We are meant to raise this fire. So we see fire in two areas of our body, symbolically speaking, of course, the Kundalini fire at the root chakra, and then the solar plexus chakra, which is ruled by the fire element. The root chakra, from where the Kundalini fire or Christ fire raises, is ruled by the earth element, because it is from our root chakra that we realize what we need to have basic survival skills, right? We satisfy all of our base desires and needs as human beings, as animal beings at the root chakra. So basic survival is drinking water, eating food, keeping warm, right? Procreation, and so on and so forth. The root chakra, just like every other chakra, has a level of consciousness because each chakra is composed of a gland, neurons, clusters, and networks of information moving in and out of the body and through the body. So the root chakra has a consciousness, the sacral chakra has a consciousness, the solar plexus, and so on and so forth. So the consciousness of the root chakra, the very foundation chakra, is saying, I need to survive. That's it. We haven't gone up yet, right? We haven't gone to the sacral. We haven't gone up to the solar plexus. The root chakra consciousness is, I need to survive. I need to feel safe. I need to feel secure. And this is where the fire starts from, right? So as we eventually raise the fire, we reach the sacral, which is ruled under the water element. And here, the basic need is I need to feel. I need to sense. I need to emote. I need to express emotion. I need to surrender. I need to go with the flow. I need to move with life, right? That is why the sacral is ruled under the water element. And then we reach the solar plexus, the fire chakra, which is the I am. It's, as I said in some episodes ago, where the ego develops. So here's where the ego develops, and we need our ego as human beings. This is where we develop psychic autonomy. This is where we develop personal boundaries. This is how we develop a sense of self, to know who we are, right? We're no longer in the root, which is just, I need to survive. We're up in the solar plexus, which signifies I am. And this particular chakra is the chakra of the will, right? However we are moving through life, however we are showing up, however we are willing life into existence, however we are manifesting, right? We love that word. We love to manifest. It all comes from the solar plexus because this is how and from where we move forward. So that's the fire element. So up until now, these bottom three chakras represent our animal chakras or our earthly selves chakras. It's the energy centers that really have to do with our human, animal, physical experience. So now in regards to Luciferian fire and Christ fire, basically, if we stay stuck at the solar plexus, if we don't move the energy up to the heart, to the throat, to the third eye, and to the crown, this is basically evoking or moving through Luciferian fire. Because not only have we not reached our spiritual self or spiritual nature yet, but we've also not accessed our heart, which is where Eros Gamos occurs, the sacred marriage, right? The union of the masculine and the feminine, the union of spirit and matter, the integration of both halves, let's say, right? The heart is the middle. It's chakra number 4. We have the bottom 3, and then we have the upper 3. The upper 3 chakras are the spiritual chakras. The bottom 3 chakras are the animal chakras. The heart is the bridge. The heart bridges the animal with the spiritual. But it's not to say that the animal is bad or that we don't need the animal because we want to become spiritual. This is the base. This is the foundation. It's like building a house. If we're building a house, we need a foundation. So we need to develop our root chakra. We need to develop our sacral. We need to develop our solar plexus, but we need to keep going up. So if we stay stuck at the solar plexus, or if we do not want to move, or we're very much at the egoic, we're very much in the egoic experience, this is Luciferian fire. This is also possibly being very successful in life, right? When we are in the energy of the solar plexus, and if we have a very powerful solar plexus and we've not moved the energy up, this means we have a very, very strong ego. And the ego is very good at making things happen, forcing things to happen, hustle, right? Hustle culture, going in the rat race. It all has to do with the material experience because that is Lucifer. Lucifer is very much about the material experience. This is why it was the serpent that tempted Eve, the feminine matter. Lucifer and the feminine principle are very much interconnected. This is why they used the name of Venus, morning star, the bringer of light, for Lucifer. Lucifer has a lot of feminine undertones because of the material or hyper material experience. The material experience is not bad. We are here to enjoy the material experience. We are here to enjoy money and pleasures and, delicious food and all that. I'm not saying that is an issue. It's just when that becomes the only focal point, and when we become hyper materialistic and disconnected from our spiritual selves, it's disconnected from our heart, disconnected from our spiritual selves, that is Luciferian fire. And of course, it can be someone that is very sexually active. This can be someone that has a lot of money, very successful, right? Like all kinds of manifestations can occur when we are just up here, stuck at the solar plexus level, feeding this fire without it being basically the will and the manifestation of the Christed fire, the Christed light, which we need to achieve up here, which I'll get into in a little bit. So remember when I was talking about the energy circulation, right, of the microcosmic orbit in Taoism, Kundalini yoga, right, raising the Kundalini fire, the current of liberation, the current of manifestation. So we can actually raise our sexual fire from our root chakra all the way up into our solar plexus and stay here. We can live a complete life from just being at the solar plexus. And we can manifest. We can make things happen. As I said, we can be very, very successful because this is the ego's domain. The ego is very much connected to the physical condition. The ego knows very much what is going on, within reality, but the ego is completely oblivious to the unconscious and to the superconscious, right? So that is being disconnected from the higher centers. That is also being disconnected from the heart. So we can see sexuality also being very much misused if we stay at this level. This is very much the sexual expression of being self-involved, being manipulative, not giving a shit about the person that you're sleeping with. You only want to get off, right? Feeling only pleasure, having as many one night stands as possible, but being totally shut off from your heart and spiritual nature. Having a friend with benefits, but just using that friend with benefits, right? There's like all kinds of examples of how you can be using the sexual fire, the Kundalini fire, under quote unquote Luciferian purposes. Now, again, and for the sake of this episode, when I say Lucifer, I just mean the shadow, right? As I said, we all have a shadow. And the shadow, by working with the shadow, is, yes, ultimately the giver of light. But that is the Christ expression. Because, as I said, Lucifer and the Christ are two sides of the same coin. If we want the Christ, we have to move through Lucifer. If we want Christed fire, we have to move through Luciferian fire. Shadow fire, the fire that is initially just for our survival, right? Just for the material experience. And that's why there's a lot of suffering as far as sexuality is concerned, as far as actually working and utilizing this energy. There's a lot of ignorance and a lot of misinformation and lack of information that really, it is from here that we actually have to begin and cultivate our spiritual selves, because this fire, if it stays only in the bottom centers, will solely give a shit about the material experience. And yes, you can be successful. Yes, you can get a lot done, but you're not going to live to your full potential. You're not going to achieve your spiritual nature. People might even get into relationships, but their heart is unavailable. They're not doing it with heart, right? How easy is it to live without putting your heart into something? I've been there. I've done a lot of living without putting my heart into something because it was barricaded, it was closed. And as far as like my porn addiction phase of life, that was full-blown Luciferian fire, right? Like just stuck at the lower centers because that sexual energy wasn't being raised. I didn't know that that's what I had to do, or that is actually what opens the door to higher spiritual awareness and knowledge and understanding. So when and if we actually start to want to work with our sexual energy and we start to move past the solar plexus and we reach the heart area, already this is starting to access Christ fire, Christ energy. Because the Christ is the union of the masculine and the feminine. The Christ as energy is both the holy fire and the holy water, right? We know that spiritual baptism happens through fire. Literal baptism happens through water. Fire is the seed, it's the masculine. Water is the womb, it's the feminine. So when we reach up to the heart, this is obviously where we experience love. Love for self, love for other. We are able to feel compassion for another human being, empathy, right? We're able to feel for another human being. Moving up the ego, actually the ego is meant to serve the heart. The solar plexus is meant to serve the heart chakra because the solar plexus is the will. Now we want to be willful in life. We want to move through life. We want to show up in life. That is our will. So it's not about negating any of these bottom centers. It's not about negating the solar plexus because it's like the fire chakra and this is like where the ego develops. I talked about the Christ energy moving up the chakras and the Christ experiencing crucifixion at the ego because it is through fire. It is through the fires of purification, the fires of transmutation, the fires of resurrection that promote spirituality. And it's not just Christianity that talks about this fire, right? This is all just the Christian definition of this universal doctrine of rebirth through holy fire, cosmic fire, sacred fire. So the heart is ruled under the air element. So I talked about in the breathwork episode how pivotal breathwork is for the spiritual path, because breathing, conscious breathing, there's so many breathwork techniques out there depending on what part of the world you're looking at, but breathing activates and stokes this inner fire, and by breathing we are actually able to move it not only into the heart space but up and down our spine, up and down and through our body. So the microcosmic orbit, moving everything up the back channel, right? So as we move the energy up It goes up to the crown, it comes back down to the front channel. That represents the current of liberation, the current of manifestation, and Kundalini yoga as well. We raise the energy up and then we bring the energy down. So the heart, even though is love, this is where we experience love, and really the foundation of everything is love. It's not the ultimate destination until we reach the crown, because what we want to do is we want to bring the energy up, not just to the heart, but eventually the throat, the third eye, and the crown, because up here is where we access light, right? And what does fire emit? Fire emits light. Fire emits heat, but fire is knowledge. And what did I say last week about the tree of knowledge? Knowledge doesn't just mean reading a book, going online and reading something or learning something from somebody, right? Knowledge. Knowledge is gnosis, and knowledge is light that is accessed through universal consciousness. But we can only access that light up here in the crown chakra when we raise the fire. We need to make fire and light one. Fire is not light yet if it stays in the bottom centers. We need to raise the fire so that it can become light, because it is light. It's supposed to be light. And then that is how we access Christ fire. That is what Christ fire means. So it can be a little bit misleading because Lucifer does translate to bringer of light, but it's false light. It's the light of the material experience only. It's about being only connected to the material experience. That's why one of his prominent symbols is the reverse pentacle, right? This reverse star. The reverse star is basically the four elements: earth, air, fire, water, and then the fifth point pointing downward, which means only the material experience. The upward direction of the five-pointed star is Christ. It's air, earth, fire, water, and then that fifth point pointing up towards the heaven is pointing up towards spirituality, right? Up is spirit, down is matter. So Luciferian fire, Luciferian energy only gives a shit about the material experience. Yes, he offered liberation and rebellion in the Garden of Eden, right? When he offered the apple and Eve and Adam gained knowledge of creation, the knowledge that duality exists, but we cannot stay in the realm of duality. So yes, he offered the apple and they were quote unquote liberated because now they were able to make choices, have quote unquote free will. But if you stay within the realm of duality and you do not realize oneness, then you are moving through Luciferian energy or shadow, right? The shadow self, which takes control of the ego. So the ego develops at the solar plexus, the shadow develops at the sacral chakra. If the ego has fuck all idea of what's going on unconsciously or has not instilled proper boundaries in general, the shadow can fully well hijack the ego because the shadow is deeper. The shadow is more unconscious than the ego. So most of the time, the ego thinks it's making decisions, but it's actually the shadow. 90% of our decision making happen through our subconscious, not consciously. So we can also relate that to the shadow in relationship to the ego. So the true liberator is the Christ, because the Christ journey is to, yes, move through duality, but to realize oneness within duality. So somatically speaking, right, like on a practical level, as I keep saying, it's to move the energy all the way up to the crown, because this is where we experience nirvana. This is where we access light. So Christ fire needs to evoke light. It needs to offer light. And when I say light, I mean access to universal consciousness, because that's what light is. It's energy. It's consciousness. Light emits information. So the whole universe is conscious. We are able to access this universe through our crown chakra. But then again, we're not also meant to stay just here. Just like we're not just meant to stay at the heart, we're also not just meant to stay at the crown. We are meant to circulate this energy. So as the raw sexual energy moves up and it transforms and it becomes spiritual energy, then we need to manifest. Then we need to anchor energy down. This is how we truly manifest in our lifetime. And we need to bring it down to the solar plexus, which is the fire chakra. So to experience Christ at the solar plexus is very, very possible, but we need to come up here first. If we go from root to sacral to solar plexus and just stay here, that's Luciferian fire. That's Luciferian energy. But if we go from the root to the sacral to the solar plexus to the heart, up to the crown, and then we bring the energy down as the current of manifestation, then we have Christ at the solar plexus. We still have an ego. We still have a sexual nature. We still want to enjoy the material experience, right? That's the solar plexus. That's the ego domain. But the ego is not in control anymore. That is the main difference. And the ego, obviously, as we moved up past the ego, when we're coming up the chakras, it experiences death. And what is the difference between Jesus Christ and Lucifer? The main difference is that Lucifer refused to believe in the power of surrender. What did Jesus Christ do that Lucifer did not do? Jesus Christ moved through the crowd with a crucifix, got nailed on top of a cross, not knowing what the fuck was going on. I mean, he did, but he also didn't. Died, and came back and resurrected. So Lucifer is resistance of death. And again, I'm saying the shadow. That is our shadow self that resists death within ourselves, resist letting go, resist moving on. It's very much about hoarding, clenching, and holding on because we need to feel safe, right? And that is all a part about needing to feel safe. And that's not a bad thing. We will always need to feel safe as human beings. We'll always need that security as human beings, but we cannot only stay in that energy because then we just start to clench. We start to grip. We don't want to let go. We want to hold on. And then life cannot evolve. We cannot move through proper evolution and change, which is what we are all here to do. So it's basically using the fire and using that fire to move through a spiritual rebirth. That is the Christ fire. The Luciferian fire is using it to just basically feed on the material experience and having all sorts of material gratifications. Again, there's nothing wrong with feeling good on the material plane, but we need to get there through the Christ. We need to get there by moving past just the solar plexus or the ego. This is why the serpent or Lucifer, the sexual energy, offered Eve and Adam this knowledge of creation as well as destruction, as well as separation. The fall of humankind happened because Lucifer offered the knowledge of separation. And as I said in last week's episode, to stay within that separation, to stay just within the realm of duality, is to embody Lucifer energy or be possessed by your shadow. So we're not in fact liberated if we stay within the realm of duality. The Christ is the true liberator because the Christ says, yes, duality exists. Yes, death exists. Yes, we need to let go. We need to die. We need to surrender. But eternal life is the only truth. Eternal life is the only reality. And I'm not talking about just leaving this body and experiencing eternal life in the afterlife. It's about moving through ego death and literally experiencing a spiritual and energetic rebirth in the same lifetime. That is possible for every single human being if they're brave enough, courageous enough to crucify their ego. And this can start with working with sexual energy. This can start with breath work. This can start with conscious breath in order to move the energy up through the microcosmic orbit, Kundalini yoga, whatever school of thought, right? But it's all the same. It's basically raising the energy through breath, which very much activates the heart, right? The air element. And then we want to bring the energy up to the higher centers. And this can also happen organically, right? The Kundalini serpent, the Kundalini energy is raising and rising organically as well. It's technically not recommended to force Kundalini awakening because the energy in itself wants to go up naturally. But of course, we go through trauma, we move through all kinds of different experiences, and there are blockages throughout the body. But the Kundalini energy is there to actually dissolve the blockages. And that is the Kundalini fire. That is the Christ fire. The Christ fire wants to move up in order to heal us, in order to liberate us, right? Remember, the back channels the current of liberation. We need to liberate first before we can truly start to manifest through the material experience, but as Christed, as spiritually baptized through holy fire. That's the Pentecost, right? I talked about a few episodes back. Fire is descending from the sky. That's the current of manifestation. So we see fire everywhere, right? We see fire in hell, Luciferian fire, but we also see the fires of heaven. We see the holy fire, right? Which is spiritual fire. And spiritual fire is meant to offer the light of consciousness, the light of God, the light of the source that we can use to manifest. Because scientifically speaking, light is energy, and energy wants to be made matter. That's what happened in the universe. Energy wanted to become matter. That's why everything is here. That's why matter exists through energy. Everything was energy first. So when we bring our old matter up through liberation up into the higher centers, and then we start to really access universal knowledge, universal light, universal energy, we bring that energy down into the physical, and that is how we manifest, through the solar plexus, through the fire chakra. But we did a loop, right? We did a whole loop. We went up to the crown and then back down. We didn't just move up from the root and stay stuck at the solar plexus, which, let me tell you, that's what happens with every single human being. Because then when we reach the heart, this is where the real work starts, right? Heart is love. Heart is where we store grief. This is where we experience loss, and we have breakups, and we lose friends, right? This is where we want to really protect ourselves. So this is how we can also develop blockages in our heart chakra. So when the energy faces a blockage in the heart, it stays in the solar plexus. It doesn't mean we're all bad people, that we're evil because we're operating from the solar plexus. As I said, in my porn addiction phase of life, I was very much in my solar plexus. I didn't move up to my heart. I didn't move up to my higher centers. I was not evil. I was not bad. I mean, it was a very hard, grueling time in my life, but it just comes to show that this is the energy of just knowing your material, physical experience and basically identifying with your ego, identifying with the stories you tell yourself. And we don't want to do that as spiritual beings. We want to witness, we want to have thoughts and feelings and emotions, but also not to identify with them, to know that they're just passing through us. And that is how we can take control of ourselves. That is how we can take control of our lives, by not being possessed by our thoughts and feelings. They'll always be there. It's not about getting rid of them, but it's also about not identifying or attaching to them. That is basically how we practice spirituality and how we evoke the witness, which I've talked about in previous episodes. So I think that's definitely enough food for thought. I'll leave it here for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I don't know if there's more coming as far as esoteric Christianity and sacred sexuality is concerned, but I feel like today's episode really kind of put all the pieces together. But we'll see. We'll see what's cooking for next week. So if you're on YouTube, please hit that like, subscribe button. I so greatly appreciate it. It motivates me. It helps me out. Please share the episode if you so feel called. If you're also on one of the podcast platforms, do so as well. You can send me a message there. I am also on social media. Please come find me on Substack, Threads, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. I'd love to see you over there as well. I will be back next week, of course, with a brand new episode here on Bridger of Worlds every Thursday. And as always, in closing, please remember that you are the medicine and I am just the messenger. Thank you very much.